Welcome to Global Perspectives. Many people set out to change the world, but one of them, James Backus, is actually succeeding. He's here to tell us his story.
Global Perspectives with Pulitzer Prize-winning commentator John Bercia.
Welcome to the show, Jim.
Thank you so much, John. It's good to be back.
It's such a pleasure to have you here. You have done so many things in your life, locally, nationally, internationally, that you are one of those few people we can actually call an institution. And not just that.
I'm not dead yet, John.
No, a living institution, but an effective one. And I think that's the key to what we want to talk about today. But before we get to the point where you are changing the world in so many ways, why don't we talk a bit about what you were doing before, when you were young and not quite focused on what you wanted to do. So maybe take us back to one of those times and tell us what was in your mind.
Well, I started out as a newspaper reporter at the age of 14. My 8th grade civics teacher, Julian Stenstrom, had left the school system and become editor of the Sanford Herald, and I went to work for him as a stringer in South Seminole County. They paid me 20 cents an inch for every column inch of copy I wrote, so I wrote a lot of very long stories. That plus an affinity for reading Thomas Wolfe affected my prose for many years before I learned how to trim it back. At the age of 18, I went to work for the Orlando Sentinel, our common alma mater, and I was covering statewide politics for the Sentinel while I was still a teenager. In 1970, I was still an undergraduate at Vanderbilt and working in the summers and vacations for the paper. And I desperately wanted to cover the political races that year. There was a governor's race and a Senate race. The paper wanted to encourage me, but it didn't want to risk having someone so young cover any candidates who truly mattered. So they sent me out to cover two candidates who didn't matter because they were such dark horses. Their names were Reuben Askew and Lawton Chiles. And for those who know anything about Florida history, Reuben Askew is certainly on the short list for the greatest governors in Florida history. Indeed, he's been named by the Kennedy School at Harvard as one of the 10 greatest American governors of the 20th century. Lawton Chiles was also governor of Florida, and that year in 1970 he walked across the state, got elected to the United States Senate. I walked with him.
Tell us about that part, because that's where you gain some insights into his potential that a lot of others were missing.
Well, it's a typical journalism story. I was the only candidate covering Lawton at the time. Of course, I called him then Senator Chiles. He was state senator. But no one thought he had a chance, and he had this gimmick, this idea, and not a gimmick for him, but walking the length of the state 1,000 miles and getting to know people at the grassroots. I was traveling with him. I was the only one walking with him. His campaign couldn't afford any aides to do so. So I got to know him very well and was, of course, influenced by him for years thereafter. And I saw that this idea, this walk, was catching on. And every night in the motel room, I would call the desk because there were no smartphones or laptops at the time. I would actually pick up the telephone and dictate a story. I would literally say, "Give me a rewrite." And I would dictate this story saying the walk is catching on. And they didn't run the story. And about the third time I did that, the managing editor at the time, a good friend of ours that you and I both know, Stan Roberts, got on the phone and he said, "Look, kid, we want you to have a good time out there. You're doing a good job, but don't get carried away. This guy doesn't have a chance." A few days later, the Sentinel's rival, the St. Petersburg Times, did a story after we passed through St. Petersburg saying, "The walk is catching on."
You were lying.
And thereafter, I had a little bit more credibility with the rewrite desk.
Well, you did not maintain a career in journalism, but went in other directions, including law school and so forth. What prompted you to move in those directions? You also did a lot of political work.
Well, I had started, even before I went to work for the Sentinel, handing out leaflets in the 1964 governor's race in Florida. when I was, just barely in junior high school, for a guy named Robert King High. Robert King High was the mayor of Miami Beach, and he was a friend of Bobby Kennedy's, who was in favor of civil rights, which was not very popular in Florida in 1964. I'm not sure how popular it is for some today. And he was actually stoned on the steps of the courthouse in Chattahoochee in the Panhandle for his civil rights views. One of the people standing next to him was his Northwest Florida campaign manager, a state senator named Reuben Askew, for whom, as you'll recall, after leaving the Sentinel and leaving my graduate studies in history at Yale, I went to work for at the age of 24. I became his youngest aide in Tallahassee. I had been inspired by his support for civil rights, and I began to work alongside him thereafter for a number of years on civil rights, judicial reform, educational improvement, environmental improvement, all the many reforms for which Florida was notable at the time, and for which Askew was noted, and frankly bringing Florida into the 20th century.
Well, and we could spend the entire show talking about just these pieces, but maybe fast forward a little bit. You yourself went into politics for a period of time at the congressional level. In particular, you did some noteworthy work, and then off in other directions. Why don't we talk about those for a bit,
Sure.
And then we'll get into some other questions. But anytime you want to go off on a tangent and tell us an anecdote about something, please do.
Well, I was elected to Congress in 1990, and at the time I became the first Democrat in the history of the South to win an open election in a majority Republican district. It's helped through the years that I look like a Republican. But I was quite happy about that, and it gave me a chance to do a lot of good work for the people in Central Florida during the time I was there. I'm proud of what I was able to do on a number of levels. I was the leading sponsor in the House of Representatives for the International Space Station. I was one of the leaders in the effort to repair the Hubble telescope rather than abandon it. My district included the Kennedy Space Center, so I was involved in a lot involving the space program. I was involved in all kinds of environmental issues. I helped double the size of the Pelican Island National Wildlife Refuge that we have, that was created by Theodore Roosevelt, the oldest in the country. I helped create, and I'm quite proud of this, the Archie Carr National Wildlife Refuge for endangered sea turtles. I was involved as the principal House sponsor. Former Senator and Governor Bob Graham, a close friend of mine, was the Senate sponsor of the bill and the appropriation to restore the original channel of the Kissimmee River and bring it back to its natural state. I'm quite proud of what I did for the University of Central Florida in terms of bringing home a lot of federal dollars to expand our university. And in addition, because I had been a trade negotiator for the United States when Governor Askew was Ambassador Askew and the United States Trade Representative after he was governor, I was very actively involved, even as a junior member in the House, in international trade. So I was one of the leading sponsors for normalizing trade relations with China. I was one of the leading advocates of the North American Free Trade Agreement. And I was one of the 6 original co-sponsors of the implementing legislation for the Uruguay Round Trade Agreements that established the World Trade Organization. Then I decided not to seek yet another term in the House. I had a young family. I had a wife who thought I should be pursuing other interests besides remaining in the Congress. And in 1995, I was nominated by the United States and won the competition along with 6 others to become the first 7 judges on the new appellate body of the World Trade Organization, which is the Supreme Court of World Trade. And I was twice the chairman of the appellate body, the chief judge of the WTO in international trade disputes involving about 98% of all world commerce. I did that for nearly a decade before completing my service as judge and chief judge in 2004. Since that time, I've been involved in all kinds of global endeavors worldwide, and I still am.
Mm-hmm. And that's wonderful. And one of those global endeavors that has its roots here at UCF is your new center. So why don't you tell us a little bit about that, because some people will be hearing about it for the first time.
I have spent much of the past dozen years working on issues relating to continuing to free world trade and world investment to increase global poverty, increase global prosperity and reduce global poverty. I've been very active in the climate change movement. I was one of the advisors to the United Nations on the Paris Climate Agreement. Before going to the WTO as a judge, I had been very active in the Congress in the early days in calling for addressing climate change back in the early 1990s. And I've been involved globally in the effort to establish what we've now established, United Nations Sustainable Development Goals for the world. 194 countries have agreed on global goals for sustainable development. I was the chair of the Global Sustainability Council for the World Economic Forum, and I'm actively involved in all those things still. I decided a year ago that rather than to continue what I was doing at the time, which was practicing international law in a private practice as sort of a day job, and on the side doing all of these other global endeavors, I wanted to do the global endeavors full time. And John Hitt and Dale Whitaker and others were kind enough to give me an opportunity to come to the University of Central Florida, become a professor of global affairs, and more significantly, create and direct a new center that we're building here, the Center for Global Economic and Environmental Opportunity, which broadly speaking is committing to doing all kinds of things in Central Florida and also worldwide to promote sustainable development.
This is something that we hear about quite a lot, and there are supporters and detractors in terms of the various methods that have been used and are being used. But generally speaking, are you hopeful about where we are, or do you think we still face an uphill battle in trying to accomplish some of these goals?
Well, it's always an uphill battle to accomplish goals that are very ambitious. The first of the 17 Sustainable Development Goals to achieve by 2030 is to eliminate poverty worldwide. So that's a tall order. And there are other goals that are nearly as ambitious. These, however, are things that need to be done. The SDGs, as we call them, are successors to the Millennium Development Goals. The Millennium Development Goals were a good catalyst for a lot of global accomplishment. And I think the Sustainable Development Goals will be as well. There's several billion people worldwide now who are actively engaged in trying to make these things happen. I'm just one of the willing worldwide who's working on these issues. There are many more at UCF and many more throughout Florida who are. So we have our work cut out for us. We especially have our work cut out for us because of the current geopolitical state of the world, when so many countries are tempted to turn inward and away from the rest of the world. And not try to engage in international cooperation to deal with global problems. And of course, I think that the world is not only interconnected, it's interdependent. And unless we have international cooperation, we won't be able to do anything we want to do nationally.
Well, let's continue talking about the poverty issue. It would be wonderful if we could eliminate poverty here, nationwide, worldwide, in a relatively short period of time. But when you say eliminate, are you talking about controlling it to the point where we actually are in a position to eliminate it 100%, or is that...
The goal is to eliminate it 100%. And this is not as starry-eyed a goal as you might think. unbeknownst to much of the world, and certainly unbeknownst to many American people, we have lifted 1 billion people out of poverty worldwide over the past generation. Now, we still have more than 1 billion people in the world who are still living on a pittance from an American perspective, less than $1.20 per day. The goal of the SDGs is to start by eliminating extreme poverty and then move on to try to eliminate all poverty. That's the goal, and there are many ways that you can continue to try to achieve that. One way is by continuing to lower the barriers to trade and investment, because it's the greater overall economic gains of the world because of lower barriers to trade and investment that has done the most to try to lift people out of poverty. Another thing you can do is have what's necessary domestically as a companion to more open borders, and that is domestic reforms that make certain that the economic gains from more trade and investment are shared more equally. That's where we've fallen down in the United States and elsewhere, and that's a change that's required domestically in every country in the world, including our own.
So when you talk about these complicated objectives, very, very difficult to accomplish in a short period of time, and the average person is listening and thinking, well, what could I do? And young people in particular are paying attention because they're disproportionately affected, and they will continue to be going into the future. Is there something that they can do to participate in addressing these problems?
Reuben Askew taught me many things. He was my mentor in every respect. One of the things he drummed into me when I was very young was that the fact that we can't solve all the problems in the world personally is not an excuse for not doing what we can. And what we can do as individuals may be local, it may seem to be small, but guess what? If we all do what we can do and we do it together, it adds up to a whole lot. Our only chance for succeeding with many of these sustainable development goals is if we do it through partnerships of all kinds. In fact, that's the 17th of the 17 goals, to develop partnerships globally. And in particular, we'll succeed if we have affirmative, action-oriented, cross-cutting networks of volunteers at the grassroots of the world, all over the world, who are working on these issues. Because then we can see what works through human innovation, and then we can emulate it elsewhere. We can scale it up. And by seeing what works, we can know what kinds of rules we need to have in place nationally, internationally, and globally in order to enable these types of continued successes at the grassroots to occur. And if I'm an individual, I have to ask myself, what can I do? What more can I do? This is a question I asked myself a year ago. What more can I do to contribute to the world? And I decided that I could contribute most of the world by trying to be a catalyst and try to help others be catalysts for making all of these things happen. And there are other people who have many more talents than I have, and different talents, that they can bring to bear on these issues of global sustainable development, which include everything from education and healthcare and sanitation and water quality to gender equity and on and on. All the things that come together to determine whether we have the right kind of sustaining atmosphere in which human beings can grow and flourish and thrive, and in which human freedom can actually mean something.
So if I'm a young person, college level, sitting in a classroom thinking, what could I do? What would your advice be? Today, get up and do A, B, and C, and you'll be contributing to this cause in a positive way.
Well, first of all, in terms of any volunteer work, you're only going to stay with it if you're doing something you find interesting. So what is your passion? Is your passion early childhood education? Is your passion stopping human trafficking? Is your passion doing something about protecting the coast? Is your passion protecting endangered sea turtles and other endangered species? What is your passion? If you don't have one, you need one. But I think everyone probably has a passion of some kind that they can bring to bear on making a difference in the world. If your passion is simply reading, well, you can teach other people how to read. So there's no lack of things people could do. And then, yes, there's much we can each do on our own, through our own inventiveness, to make a difference, but also we can multiply the effect of what we do if we work together with other people who share our interests. And then we found in our work on the Sustainable Development Goals that if different people with different related interests come together and collaborate, just as we do in interdisciplinary work in the academy, then that can produce the kinds of creative innovations that can show locally what needs to be done globally.
So, thinking again about something we discussed at the beginning where you said that you didn't see yourself as an institution, but I would disagree, and here's why. A lot of people try to master certain things. Some go out and try to master many things. You've actually done that, master of many trades, and you've done it on a global basis. And you could have said, well, I'm finished. I've done all that, now I'll go and tend to my garden or something else. But instead, you're re-engaging in a very, very dramatic way. And so what is it that inspires you? What causes you to get up in the morning and say, why am I putting myself through this when I know it's going to be hard?
I believe my life is only worthwhile if I serve other people. So the only question for me is, how am I going to serve? I was in politics for a while. I ran for office. I won elections. I haven't lost any. But being in politics is only one way to serve. The only reason to be in politics is if you want to serve, but there are many other ways to serve. And I've been fortunate to find some, and I'm now creating more. I've tried to create a role for myself in the world as something of a global gadfly. And the other things I've done, and being in the Congress and being chief judge of the World Trade Court and other pursuits, give me a calling card that I can use to try to advance all the causes in which I so strongly believe.
That must be a special experience to have your name in such a prominent place. Basically, it's a household word in so many countries.
Well, I don't worry too much about that, but I'm really more interested in building institutions than I am in being thought of as one. When I left Geneva after my service on the court there, which was, of course, service in creating and building the court, which is now the most productive and successful international tribunal in the world and in the history of the world. I said at the time, and this was 15 years ago, that we need to remember the words of Emerson, one of my favorite writers, that the test of an institution is what happens after the last of the founders is gone. And I was the last of the founders to leave the appellate body of the WTO. I'm proud that 15 years later, they've continued to stand up for the rule of law, being impartial and unflinching and taking legal decisions irrespective of political considerations, not being influenced by politics. They're being pressured now, I'm afraid, but they've withstood that pressure. We had a practice of speaking by consensus. In the decade in which I was there was never one dissent to any of our opinions, which of course enhanced the stature of the court and its efficacy in upholding the international rule of law and trade, and also in proving that there could be such a thing as the international rule of law generally. And I'm pleased that 15 years later they're still doing that. So I'm most interested in building institutions. Therefore, much of my work is in building frameworks of rules worldwide, whether it's trade, investment, climate change, other forms of environmental protection, whatever it may be, that will enable us to create a sustainable global prosperity. Indeed, this is what my next book is about. It'll be coming out in July, and I talk about what I see as our best way forward, about how to grow and govern the global economy in ways that will work both economically and environmentally. For me, economy and environment are one and the same thing. So therefore, the rules we use to govern ourselves and to guide our economy and our way of life should reflect the fact that economy and environment are truly one and the same.
Great. Well, thank you so much for joining us today, Jim Backus. And thank you. For Global Perspectives, I'm John Bercia. We'll see you next time.